Hi, guys.
Are we on? We're starting? We're ready? All right. No tuxedos today, so I hope you guys didn't dress up. That would be awkward. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our wine school number 2, our second session. As you probably saw, we are going to cover white Burgundy today. Just as a reminder, I'm Chris Stang, co-founder and CEO of the Infatuation. With me is Grant Reynolds and Ron Burgundy. Grant is a partner in Delicious Hospitality Group and a very, very smart and well-respected sommelier. We wrote a book together. Hopefully you can see right here, How to Drink Wine. It disappears. It's a magic book. This comes out on May 12th, and this is sort of the reason that we're doing these, is we figured we could sort of teach from the book almost while we're all locked up in our house together. So a couple things to cover before we start. Hopefully you all know how to use the Q&A function in Zoom, which is right at the bottom there. You can hit that button, you can ask us questions, and then Grant and I, we're gonna do it different this time than we did last week in that we're gonna try to hit the questions like in real time rather than circling back. So ask questions there as we get into stuff, and then you guys can sort of help us guide the conversation while we talk through things. And the goal is to make this as interactive as possible, even though we can't actually talk to each other, and hopefully, you know, make this useful and fun for you as you hopefully sit and drink. So let's start with a couple quick things before we jump into it. Number one, we're gonna drop a link in here. Hopefully you guys have seen that we've been raising some money through the Infatuation and Zagat for World Central Kitchen and a few other really good organizations that are trying to help support restaurants, you know, throughout everything that's going on. And then also, we have a wine newsletter, which is where we actually send out information about the bottle, one of the bottles we're going to talk about today. So if you don't have that or you haven't signed up, just go to theinfatuation.com/wine. You'll actually see there information on the book, pre-ordering the book, and then also you can sign up for the newsletter. And the goal is we'll get into a rhythm here with the wines themselves so that we can be drinking the wines, magic wines, they disappear also, magic wines together while we talk through these things. So Grant, you want to kick off and talk a little bit about, well, let me just set up. I think the reason we picked white Burgundy, besides the fact that we really like to drink it, is that it felt like a good opportunity to use a certain wine to teach random stuff about wine, right? So white Burgundy feels like a good way to talk about like why in France wines are named certain things or certain ways. It's a good way to talk about the grape Chardonnay. It's a good way to talk about places in Burgundy. And it's just sort of like a good vehicle to teach something. Can you guys not see Grant still? I'm getting lots of messages here. I can see.
I can see
I
you.
can see Grant. Somebody tell me what to do. Okay, we'll keep going until we figure this out though. It looks like we can still only see me. Give us a second. Oh wait, we can see him now. Kevin says we can see him.
What's up, Kevin?
Only Kevin can see you. So this is just for Kevin, this whole thing. Nobody else. It says they only see you when you talk. Oh, you know what? Try and go. If you guys are on, you need to go. You probably need to be on gallery view or speaker. Does that work better? Speaker view? What about now? Somebody tell me something. Yeah, all right, great. Thanks, Lynette. All right, now everybody's here. Is that right? Great. Okay. So hopefully you paid attention to what I just said. It's very important, but don't worry, we'll circle back to everything. Grant, hi, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm really pissed off you were late. Also, why does Zoom not really know where my head starts and where it ends? It's probably more a thing for my head than it is Zoom. So, yeah, you look good though. Behind Grant is Ron Burgundy, the white version of Ron Burgundy, who's from our book. Behind me is a part of Burgundy that we're going to talk about today, and where the wine is from that Grant will set up right now. So you want to talk about this beautiful bottle.
Yeah. I hope everybody has something to drink. Is there a little bit of feedback? I think we're good now. Okay. Cool. So yeah, we're gonna talk about white Burgundy today with Ron Burgundy and Chris Stang. So Chris, I don't know if you want to throw the label up
Yeah.
or not. We can kind of go through a little bit and then we'll talk about how it tastes and all the geeky stuff about Burgundy too. But
Yeah, why don't you start talking about the wine and I'll pull it up and then you guys can all
Wait,
see the
so-
bottle, the label really quick.
you hear Burgundy a lot, and what's most important to note is that it's a place. That's where Chris is and where he was last time too. So the really the most important thing to think about with Burgundy is that it's not a grape, but the two grapes are Pinot Noir if it's red wine, and then Chardonnay. There we go. That's my kitchen counter. And Chardonnay if it's a white wine. So Chardonnay is probably more well known to everybody than white Burgundy would be, just because it's now planted all over the world and they call it Chardonnay. Whereas in Burgundy, what you can see on the label here is where it says Macon, and also the three words below it, La Roche Veneuse. The French like to think that you don't have to put the name of the grape on the label, but if you know Macon, or in I don't know, there's probably 20 other villages that could be listed on it. All you need to know is that if it's from that village, that it must be 100% Chardonnay if it's a white wine, or 100% Pinot Noir if it's a red, which makes things really tricky, right? To try to figure it out, because I don't know all of the towns myself. And there's really no real information on the label to be able to say that, hey, this is a Burgundy. Other than,
Right. This one doesn't say, this actually doesn't say Burgundy on it anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So you're kind of shit out of luck, but Macon is really a pretty common area. It's a town in the southern part. So if it says Macon, it's got to be 100% Chardonnay. And then we'll talk about some other towns that are 100% Chardonnay too.
Why don't you also just talk about, because there's a couple things, I think for me, it was always helpful to learn this, that there are definitely like really important, really well-known towns in Burgundy that you've probably all seen on labels, like Chassagne-Montrachet, Meursault. What are some of the other ones?
So Montrachet, you hear people like throw that around. That's the name of a vineyard. It's the most expensive, I think some of the most like expensive agricultural land in the whole world. It's a really small vineyard, and there's two towns, Chassagne, Montrachet, that threw their name on it. And when we mean towns, they're tiny little villages that are just scattered around with vineyards. And then Pouligny-Montrachet is just the next town up. Meursault is another town that has a bunch of vineyards in it. And those three towns are really the heart of white wine in Burgundy. It's called the Côte de Beaune, and they make some of the
bigger region.
Yeah.
I think what we're trying to set up basically is just that there's a bunch of towns. Some of them are more well-known than others, and some of them are probably more common that you might see when you walk into your local wine store. Macon is one that maybe you don't see as often, but it's still relatively common, would you say?
Yeah, I think those three towns, the wines all tend to be a little like pretty expensive just because they're much smaller and they're more celebrated, historically speaking, right? Whereas like the Macon, or even if you can see on a label where it just says Bourgogne, what's on your shoulder there, that just means Burgundy. And if it says Bourgogne Blanc, that means white Burgundy, and it can be from almost anywhere within Burgundy, right? So those are the three main towns: Meursault, Chassagne-Montrachet, Pouligny-Montrachet. But there's a whole bunch of towns like Macon that also make white Burgundy too.
So, and I think we picked this one because we like the price point and you like the wine. So let's talk just a little bit about this wine. Well, before we get too into that, I just want to make sure it's also really clear that, because we talked a little bit about naming conventions and why the French, you don't see Chardonnay on the label. You want to talk about a little bit more about why that is, because I think that was something that was always felt really daunting to me as you learn about wine. You're like, wait, there's so much I need to learn that, about France that I'm not going to be able to, it's not going to help me when I'm trying to learn about American wine or Italian wine. But actually it's kind of better almost because it's so structured, because that certain areas are really only going to mostly grow a handful of grapes for the most part, and that the wines will be named after those areas and not the grapes.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of if you look at France, Italy, and Spain as the, main wine making regions or countries for that matter in the world, all of those places, they focus on the towns as being what's most important. And then they have laws, like you can't write, Chassagne Montrachet on a label if it's not 100% Chardonnay. And the same thing we were talking about it the other day, Barolo, it has to be 100% of a grape called Nebbiolo. And that's just historically what they've done is in Europe, these areas are so small, and they want people to collectively, like producer to producer, to have a singular kind of experience and association with what the wine might taste like. And, history has proven itself that Chardonnay is the best white grape to be grown in that area. And it would be foolish for anybody to plant Sauvignon Blanc or Chenin Blanc, which is another French grape, in that zone. So they have all these really strict wine laws that if you're gonna, you can do whatever you want, but it'll just say like Vin de France, which really just is mostly just kind of garbage wine. But yeah, in Europe, it creates a lot of confusion because what you see most prominently on a label isn't the grape, but it's the region. And then you got to kind of know what grape is associated with said region.
Right. Question about, because this one gets sort of dovetailed in sometimes, but it's worth addressing. Chablis is a pretty common wine that you've all probably seen or had. And, it's technically, like, talk about Chablis and its relation to Burgundy, because a lot of people lump it in, but it's also different.
Yeah. So Chablis, so Burgundy, think of Burgundy like a state, and then there's a whole bunch of counties within it, right? And there's kind of the heart of it is this slope. It's like a long running hill called the Côte d'Or. And that's kind of the center of the state. And then north and south of that are like satellite areas. And Chablis is the northernmost, and it's really cold up there. The soil's really different, and they make wine. They just make it differently than they do in the other parts of Burgundy. So I think that's why Chablis has a lot of its own brand recognition, although the grape is still Chardonnay. And legally, yes, it's still a part of Burgundy. However, flavor-wise, it's a different animal. Beaujolais, which some people were asking about last time, technically, if you're really just looking at like wine law for whatever that's worth, is also a part of Burgundy, but it's a different grape, it's a different culture. The whole thing is totally different there.
But I will tell you, like, I love white Burgundy and I love Chablis. I obviously drink them with different purposes. Like if I'm eating oysters, I want to drink Chablis with it, but they're different but similar, I think, in a lot of ways. A question that's and by the way, if you guys can see, you can upvote questions by like clicking the thumbs up, and it'll help make sure we know if a couple of you want us to address things. That's also helpful to know. So really simple one: what food does white Burgundy go with?
Oh man, I think white Burgundy is like if you're want to drink white wine and you're having chicken or meat, anything like that, white Burgundy is like bold enough and rich enough. We'll talk about how this wine tastes in a little bit, but to stand up with that, like the classic stuff is that it goes with shellfish, we're being fancy, lobster, Chablis and oysters is a really common thing. Really anything that's like
Netflix, not eating food.
yeah, exactly. Just hanging. But yeah, I think if for us it's a white wine, it's usually I don't know if you're like at a tasting menu restaurant, white Burgundy is usually the last white wine that you have, just because of the way it's made. It spends a little bit of time in oak, which we can talk about. So the wines tend to be kind of creamier and a little bit richer and less fruity. So if you just think of like progression of flavors, this is one of the more powerful flavors. So therefore you have it at the end. So it's, I like to drink it right out of the gates, but often people start with kind of a lighter white wine for whatever, salads, appetizers, that kind of thing. And then white Burgundy you can go into kind of later in the meal.
What about cheeses to pair it with? That's one that's on here that's getting thumbs up.
Yeah.
For a pepper jack, maybe some sort of grocery store cheese. No, I'm kidding.
I'm a big fan of cheddar. Don't hate on cheddar cheese. My father literally gave me a giant block of Cabot for Christmas because he lives in Vermont. But it's France regionally has wines and it also has cheese too. Cheese law, the main cheese of Burgundy is called Comté, which is kind of like salty cheddar or Parmesan in a lot of ways. But I don't really like red wine and cheese. It doesn't really make sense to me. So I do think Burgundy goes with like soft cheeses. You can drink it with like brie. You can drink it with hard cheeses. I think it's string cheeses, nice cheeses.
Somebody asked a question about temperature, which that's come up a bunch, and I think that's actually really good, especially with white wines.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, to me, white Burgundy is always like its temperature is really important because if it's too cold, like you can't really taste all the good stuff. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's what happens. Is white Burgundy, I think, is a like Sauvignon Blancs. If we're getting like really nitty gritty, white wine. I mean, nobody's sticking a thermometer in the temperature of the wine, right? But the average, like the best temperature I'd say for white Burgundy is on the warmer end of the spectrum for white wine, the warmest, so like 45 degrees, which really just means that your fridge is probably, hopefully, sub 40 degrees now, like 37, 38 degrees. That's where food has to be kept. So pull it out of the fridge and let it warm up a little bit. But because white Burgundy is like so rich and kind of creamy, it's better if it's warmer. Otherwise, if it's too cold, you're not going to taste any of that stuff and it'll just taste really tart like a lemon. And Sauvignon Blanc or Riesling or grapes like that are really just about being fruity and crisp, you can drink those super cold and the wine's really not going to change that much.
A lot of questions about picking the wine, like finding a good white Burgundy. So I think probably the best thing to do now is to talk about a little more about this wine, which should be available for around $30, depending on where you get it. I think at Parcel it was 28. Is that right?
Yeah.
So, it's an affordable white Burgundy, which there's certainly a lot of white Burgundy is very expensive. So you want to talk a little bit about why, what you like about this wine? I mean, it's just a fucking good wine, but why is it a good wine for $30? And then let's get into some other ones that might be, or at least another way to think about if I want to drink white Burgundy for $30, how do I do that and make sure I find something good?
Something good, definitely. So I think somebody asked this earlier about value in Chablis too. Chablis has a lot of value in it. And then there's other like satellite regions in Burgundy, like the Macon. And when I mean that, they're just outside of the really the kind of premier zones to look for. And what's best is to look for certain producers, like this producer named Merlin. And the reason I say that is that you can have a really talented winemaker who, just had the misfortune of inheritance and got some land in a spot that just isn't as sexy as somebody else, but they're really good at making wine, and so therefore their wines kind of over deliver for that region, right? So really trying to find producers that, and I think that's where going to your local wine shop and saying, hey, I want to drink a good bottle of white Burgundy. Is there any producer from, outside of the main area that you're really excited about? And hopefully they'll give you something that is either like a younger producer or somebody that's making wine kind of in the middle of nowhere, like Olivier Merlin, who's just good at making wine. But the reason I say that is that there's a lot of, if you're just going for, the least expensive version of Burgundy is Bourgogne Blanc, but all producers make that, right? So if you're just like grabbing any Bourgogne Blanc off the shelf, it might not be that exciting, or it might be absolutely amazing, depending on who the producer is. But in general, what I would do is try to buy wines that have some village listed on them versus Bourgogne Blanc. Even if it's like price per price, just because that means that it's just like a smaller selection of where the grapes could come from, and the potential for them to just be better is much higher. Does that make sense?
It does to me, Grant.
Okay.
I think, look, I will tell you that I think that it's hard because it is tough to find, or at least it's, certainly on a restaurant menu and definitely in a wine shop, like walking in and being like, I need a great bottle of white Burgundy for $28 is not an easy thing to do, right? I mean, you got to know a little bit about something. And I think that's why just talking to your person, it's just so hard to give anyone a sort of like foolproof way to do that without knowing something about a bunch of the producers or a lot about specific regions. And so maybe, like, would you say that just saying the Macon as a region is usually going to be a good value? Because that's something I think people can hold on to and say, like, cool, I'm going to look for that on a wine list, or I'm going to look for that in a store.
Totally. Yeah, I would say the Macon, also Chablis, though, it'll taste a little bit different, are the two most value right now, where you have a concentration of really good winemakers and the wines are still really cheap. For sure.
Cool. All right. So you mentioned like Chablis will taste a little different. Why don't we talk about this wine, what how it tastes, and then it's actually probably good to talk about like how a Chablis might be different, or how, because I do want to also make sure we cover the different sort of designations inside of Burgundy and where this wine would fall versus the really expensive stuff.
Yeah. So somebody just asked a great question, Terry, too, which I'll talk about. But the thing with Burgundy and just with Chardonnay in general is that often it's aged in oak barrels versus stainless steel barrels. This wine does a combination of both, but not almost all red wines, like I would say 95% of all red wines are aged in oak. So you talk kind of less just about it less in red wine, whereas there's very few white wines that are aged in oak. And the thing is that oak really changes both the way the wine smells and tastes, but also the texture of the wine. So Chablis isn't aged in oak very, very, very rarely. So that's why one of the reasons why the wine is so like crisp and kind of salty. Whereas this wine, I hope you're drinking it, when you taste it, the wine should be kind of feel like more just creamier and kind of more like butter rather than lemon juice. And what you often hear people talking about is like oaky wines and oaky, buttery popcorn Chardonnay, which you get from Napa Valley, or really a lot of places in California for that matter. And excuse me, some people really like that, but the flavor of oak, like in this wine, I wouldn't say is necessarily a really oaky wine, meaning that it doesn't really taste like, I don't know, popcorn or kind of like what whiskey can taste like, but you get a little bit of those flavors in it. And the oak that it's aged in makes the wine just feel kind of richer and denser when you drink it.
And how is that like? Because the question was also because California, there's California on sort of one side of the spectrum, and then wines that don't get aged in oak on the other side. And California typically, like a lot of the California Chardonnay, is so oaky that it tastes very, very different than French Chardonnay.
Yeah, definitely. So the reason for that is like some people love that stuff, right? And when you drink it, it has, I don't know, it's got sugar in it, and it really just tastes like buttery popcorn. And the reason for that is that so in this wine, they use old oak barrels. And every time you reuse a barrel, the like little bits of flavor that the oak can put into the wine start to go away. And so some producers will only use like new barrels every single year, which one is really expensive. So it makes the wines just cost more. But it imparts like a flavor to where you're not really tasting the grape anymore, but you're tasting oak. And that the difference between California Chardonnay and Burgundy comes down a lot to the alcohol. So this wine, what are we at?
13.5, I think.
13.5. A lot of California Chardonnay can hit like 14.5 and even bigger. And what that does is it just makes the wines kind of sweeter and obviously boozier. So you get a lot of those like oaky, buttery flavors just become a lot more prominent. So California Chardonnay in general it's a much like denser, almost sweeter wine, whereas this still has some of those I don't know, kind of oaky, earthy flavors to it, but it's not quite as sweet and boozy, and just a little bit more crisp while still having some of those flavors that aren't as fruity.
Let's talk about, so a lot of questions about other producers in Burgundy. There's a good question about are there any female producers in Burgundy, which I think is interesting, but also just let's talk about some other Burgundy producers that are probably good to know. And we can even like write a list in here or something and try, it's because it's going to be easier for somebody to be able to like look at it in one place than just listen to us. But let's talk about a few of the sort of important ones that you might come across.
Yeah. So there are there's one woman who sadly she passed away, I think like 2 years ago. Her last name is Laflèvre, and their wines were called Domaine Laflèvre, and they make a wine in the Macon. It's like a yellow label. She was really the first person to introduce like organic farming in Burgundy. Her name was Anne-Claude Laflèvre, and she was a legend in that area. But her wines are really readily available. They make Macon, and then they make some of the most expensive wines out there, and you see those pretty often. Domaine Drouhin, so that's Drouhin. They make really good white wine as well as red wines across the spectrum, and in a whole bunch of different price points too. And then there's like a lot of kind of smaller nitty gritty producers. Another wine that we were going to talk about is from a younger guy named Benjamin Leroux. There you go.
There's a Laflèvre, right?
Yeah. So how much is that? All right.
For $50.
$50 at Binny's. Love cool. Binny's. Yeah. Who Benjamin Leroux is, he made wine at a much larger house and then just split off and started doing his own thing under his label. and he makes wines in a whole different range of stuff too. So I
And
think
that was
I'll
our
type something
upgrade.
up.
That
What's
was our upgrade pick in the newsletter that went out here. I can pull this up just so you can see the label. Sorry, one sec. Let me figure out how to do this.
Can I answer this breakfast question?
Yeah, let's do that for sure.
What breakfast pairs best with Chablis? You should just eat cereal. I had cereal for the first time yesterday, and it was fucking delicious for the first time in a long time.
You sub in the Chablis instead of milk. That's
Yeah,
that's
you
the
just
proper way to do it.
mix it up, and you don't use a spoon. You just
No.
you gotta house it. But
So this is the LaRue.
that's it.
You want to talk about this label a little bit, just to sort of use it as another example.
Yeah, exactly. So we were talking about this town earlier as one of the main towns, called Chassagne-Montrachet. And then you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but see where it says like Oneer Cru? That means Premier Cru. Anything after that is the name of a really small piece of land. I think I can, let me switch up my virtual background here. Whoop. I'm in that vineyard now. So the town, right, is Chassagne-Montrachet, which we were saying is one of the three main towns. And then there's this classification of vineyards in Burgundy, Grand Cru being the top, which Montrachet, if you see a label that just says Montrachet, you're doing something right in life, because those wines are super expensive and really amazing. That's the name of like a single plot of land. But Premier Cru, and then whatever follows after that, is the name of a really specific vineyard. So to give you an idea, this is only like an acre and a half is the total amount of land that this wine comes from, which I don't know. I think like a New York City block is like 5 acres, something. So it's really not that much space. And the grapes have to come from that little piece of land. And the reason that it's important, the reason they put it on the label, is that you can kind of see in Chris's background how hilly everything is. And it's said that like all those little bits of land, the wine will taste different, although the grape is exactly the same. So the grape from here is still 100% Chardonnay like Macon. But this little vineyard is really special and just has different soils. The sun shines differently on it. And so therefore the wine tastes a lot different. I don't know if any of you guys have this, but if you crack into that wine will be even like just bigger and richer in flavor and have a little bit more going on than the Macon per se.
And this, what's like an average price on this? I think was it 100?
Like 100.
Yeah. And that's actually good. I think that's a good thing, because there's a question about it. And I think this is something people always try to figure, are always trying to figure out is, is there a way in your mind, like price wise, to think about, okay, if I'm going to spend this much, generally, these are the kinds of wines that I'll get, or because we had that question last time, like what's the difference in price between a Grand Cru and a Premier Cru, or, a Premier Cru and a village wine. And I think it's probably tough to say generally this is the price range, but it's probably worth, giving people a sense for, what you're going to spend on average for, a bottle that has this classification.
Yeah, I'd say like we'll use this producer as an example because he makes the whole range of them. So he makes Bourgogne Blanc, which is probably like same price as the Merlin, $25-$30.
And we just reiterate again what a Bourgogne Blanc is exactly.
Yeah, so Bourgogne Blanc is means it's from Burgundy, but the grapes can be from anywhere in Burgundy. So there's no, like what we were talking about with this is where it says the name of a vineyard. That means that the grapes have to be really from this specific place. So therefore, there's just less quantity that's possible there. So the wines just become much more expensive. whereas Bourgogne Blanc can be from anywhere, kind of within Burgundy. So they could buy a piece of land that costs less, and therefore the grapes cost less, and therefore the wine costs less too. So Bourgogne Blanc is like the inexpensive end of the spectrum, and then Grand Cru is the far end. And I'd say it starts at like $30, call it. That's kind of, if you're drinking white Burgundy, it is definitely, as a region, it's one of the more expensive ones, if not the most, for white wine. So $30 is a good place to start. Anything less than that, you should spend the same amount of money, but drink something else from somewhere else. And for this producer, it probably goes up to like $500 for different vineyards. So it's crazy. That's just because it's the same grape, it's the same person making the wine, but it's really just in relation to the total amount of wine that he can make, within that like really specific part of Burgundy.
So I'm let's say, just for the sake of the discussion, I'm someone who can't find a white Burgundy in like a price point that a price range I want to spend at my wine store, or even more importantly, probably on a restaurant list, because it's tough, especially with white Burgundy, to find bottles for less than 70, 80, $100 on a wine list just based on the markup. So if I'm not someone who wants a California Chardonnay, but I'm maybe not going to be able to spend what I need to spend on white Burgundy, what are some other Chardonnays that you might say are like good other options?
I think for me, my favorite Chardonnay in the US right now is from Santa Barbara, just because it's a little bit colder there nowadays. So I think Santa Barbara Chardonnay is better probably than Santa Barbara Pinot Noir too, for that matter. So if you're trying to keep it local, that's a really good place. And there's some wines that are pretty like inexpensive in relation to that. There's a little bit of Italian Chardonnay that's okay from the northern part of Italy, but not too much. I'd say in general, like the main spots that we see there's some good Chardonnay in Oregon, there's some good Chardonnay in Santa Barbara, Burgundy kind of across the board, right? All makes really tasty stuff. And then you find a little bit in Italy. But yeah, that's a good place to start.
And then like any other regions besides, because we talked a lot about Macon and like a few others, but other regions in Burgundy that are like other great value regions or just outside of Burgundy. And we talked a little bit about Chablis. But I think like just trying to give people more of a sense for what they can go out and look for if they can't find one of the ones we talked about.
Another good one to look for is called Pouilly Fuissé, which is Pouilly FU. The next word is FUISSE. That's a really good value region, and there's some good producers down there too. And then I would say another zone, these wines are creeping up in price, called OC Duress, which is AUXEY. So that kind of stands out on a label too. But those are three good spots. Look for the Macon. And I think somebody asked a question about the wine tariffs, which I think are at like 25% right now, are on French wine. You're definitely going to see the prices go up, but you're going to see people looking to areas like Pouilly Fuissé and the Macon and OC Duress for better wines, just because we all want to spend the same amount of money, even if the wine a little bit ago cost less. So people are drinking more of those wines than ever.
There's been a bunch of questions too about both vintage and good years, and then like aging white wine. So holding on to them. So let's start with what are a couple good years to look for, and then maybe just some things to think about if you want to either buy something and sit on it, or if you're trying to buy something older and you're trying to figure it out. and I'm going to get my computer charger, so I'll be right back. Otherwise, we're going to go offline.
All right. So vintage is only important if you're buying an older wine for the most part, right? So I would say that this wine that we're drinking, the Macon, is year after year. It's not a wine that you're gonna like, or I mean, again, but that you should buy and sit on the cellar. You should just buy it, crack it, and drink it. But the thing with vintage is that I think that like the differences of a vintage mostly come out after the wine is aged for a little bit. So we'll start in like 2010. So 2010 is a really great white Burgundy vintage. And what that means is that it's a vintage that people say has like the potential to age for a long time. And that's because it's a vintage that the wines have a lot of acidity to it. And they also have a lot of richness to it. Whereas a vintage like 2009 was a really, really hot year. So the wines are really fruity and really kind of big and boozy. And so the white wines are showing that they're not going to age quite as well. So right now, you know, we spoke about this a little bit, but climate change has really changed a lot of things. So vintages that, you know, we consider like the great vintages are vintages that have a lot of acidity rather than a lot of alcohol, because year after year they have that. But Burgundy, it was like a shit show for, I heard the statistic that I think it was, it started in 2012 probably. So like 2012, 13 and 14, those 3 years, they had such bad weather there that across those 3 years, they lost the equivalent of 1 year's crop. So every year it was down like 30%. So those years are wines that I think they're tasty right now, but they might not age quite as well as some more of the recent vintages like 2017. People are happy with 2018, but Burgundy really got banged up for a few years there, just with hail and weather. Whole bunch of places went out of business. People didn't make wine. 2016 was a terrible year too. So I would say that you're looking at like 2010, then from 2011 really to 2017 are all really challenging years. So it's pretty nuanced. It goes producer to producer. Then 2017 and 2018, things are back on track where they're making good wine in good quantities. So they're there. But vintages are tough. Like white wine, some white wines age really well, and some turn brown and kind of vinegary really quick. So it's a little bit of a crapshoot. But I'd say in general, if you're just like thinking about aging wine, just stick to red wine for now. You'll be in a much safer place.
Just because it's less likely to get gross.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the shittiest thing would be you buy a bunch of wine, you store it for a long time, and then it just doesn't taste good. You know, that's not a good place to be.
There's without getting like, this is a tricky question because it definitely leads to like some heady stuff, but it's come up a couple times, which is climate change and how because it's definitely a real thing and it's something that's changing wine, but how much is it affecting Burgundy or, you know, these wines in particular?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was saying is that all those vintages where they lost it, that's all like extreme weather from climate change, right? So not even in terms of how it affects the flavor, it just affected, you know, the amount of wine that these people can make and therefore the money, where they had these like extreme hailstorms that would just take down, you know, whole sections of vineyards, and the grapes just wouldn't grow anymore, or, you know, they'd get destroyed. And so people weren't making wine from it. So that's one thing, is that climate change has really affected it, because not only in vineyards, but everywhere, like storms are just so much more severe. But we mentioned one little town called Osi Duress, and I said that the wines are becoming more and more popular. So that's a little town that like 20 years ago, the wines weren't really considered anything because it was too cold for the wines to really taste like anything that interesting. And nowadays it's so much warmer there that the wines are in the vineyards are as good as, you know, what a more premier town like Chassagne-Montrachet was probably 20 years ago. So what you're seeing is this shift of areas that people really didn't care about. Now they care about because climate change has been in their favor. And yeah, that's, I guess, you know, a good thing for some people, but it's really changed the sort of quality, you know, association of certain towns in a lot of ways. But it's a real thing. They're all really freaked out by it, and you know, rightfully so.
For sure. A couple other questions. It looks like there was still a few questions about grapes, specifically the grape Aligoté. And you want to talk about how that fits in here? Because it does come up sometimes.
Yeah. So Aligoté is in Burgundy. You have Gamay, which is the main grape of Beaujolais, and you can plant Gamay in other places too, and that's a red grape. And then you also have Aligoté. Aligoté is like, you, with the exception of one town, you'll always see it on a label. It'll say Bourgogne Aligoté. So know that if it says Aligoté, that's the name of a grape. And the grape tastes a lot differently than Chardonnay. It's not aged in oak, and therefore the wine is, yeah, just a lot sharper and can be pretty acidic. Somebody asked us the other day, it's a wine that, I don't know, historically people would like blend this pretty nasty fruit liqueur called creme de cassis in it, which was super sweet to balance out the acidity of it. Today, there are like a couple good producers that make Aligoté, and the wines are really simple tasting, which means that they're just refreshing. They're kind of fruity. There's not that much going on. They should always be really inexpensive, and you can kind of throw them back. But the four grapes, it's like, I don't know, 95+% of the grapes that you see are Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And then Aligoté is the other white grape, and Gamay is the other red grape.
Cool. Okay, we got time for a couple others. Let's do, there's a question about storing. So I know we talked about this a little bit. I think we talked about it today, but certainly related to temperature. People always ask if they need a wine fridge, or if I'm going to hold on to some wines, even if I'm not going to hold on to them. Like there's a question here about, wine going bad, right? So, I have a wine fridge because I just like to keep the wines at a certain temperature and not have to worry about taking them out or putting them in the fridge to get them to that place. But it doesn't really, I don't think you really need a wine fridge, unless you're really trying to collect stuff and want to keep things at a certain temperature. But otherwise, you're not really at risk for something like going bad unless you bought something old and it wasn't stored right and it was bad to start with, right?
Yeah, the only thing that can happen is if it, like, you leave it by a window or something and it gets really hot, then the corks can pop up and then it'll spoil. But I don't have a wine fridge. I just throw it in my fridge, whatever is at home. And yeah, I think unless you're really like, if you're going to drink a bottle of wine within a few days, it's totally fine to leave it, just don't leave it like next to the radiator.
Don't put it in your trunk, and you should be
in your trunk.
Pretty good, at least for.
Yeah, you'll be good. But wine fridges they're a little extra unless you really are like taking down a bottle of wine a night, which these days we probably all are.
If you want a good tip, the one that I have, if you really want one, just because you want to have it and you want to store stuff at a certain temperature, there's one, the Wire Cutter, that website did a recommendation for one that's like $180, I think, and it holds 18 bottles. And it's, especially if you live in New York and you have an apartment where you can't have a big fridge, it's actually great. And it's only one zone, so everything has to stay, I think, at one temperature. But for $180, it's pretty solid if you really want one. And then, sometimes it'll come up People wonder often, like, if I chill a bottle of wine down, then it gets warm, and then I chill it again, will that screw it up?
No, you're good. It's not like reheating food. You're good. You can yeah, you can bring the wine like back and forth. Unless you're talking about wines that, for me, like where we really start to think about in the restaurants, like considering like a wine like old and needing it to, be taken extra special care of and really consider, is probably like 15 years old. Um, and then anything older than that, you don't want the wine to get like, you want it to always stay at the same temperature. You don't want to move it around too much. You got to be delicate with it because it can really change the flavor. Or there's sediment in it, which can shake it up and really change the flavor too. So I'd say like for any young wines though, it's cool if you took it out of the fridge, you didn't drink it, you got to throw it back in there. It's not going to change the taste of the wine.
Cool. Awesome. Well, that is it for us in terms of time, but just want to say thank you guys so much for tuning in and asking all these questions. This was great. It definitely helped, I think, to have a topic to talk about. So we'll keep doing that. In the meantime, though, if you have any feedback for us, we're going to keep doing these and probably actually increase the frequency of them. And I think one thing we need to talk about is we're going to try to do one at a different time because people on the West Coast, including me, start, like, I'm drinking at 3:00 right now, which is a fine thing, but we'll try to figure out how to time them up so there's like a West Coast version too. But in the meantime, like, we have an email address set up, wine@theinfatuation.com. Please send us any feedback that you have. Other questions that we didn't tackle, we'll try to get to those, and just open up a dialogue. We also, like I said, you can sign up for the newsletter that we send out, which is where we're trying to get to a place where we're like Monday, the newsletter will go out. That way you can order, if you want to order the wine that we're going to talk about, you can do that through Parcel or find it yourself. And then also just trying to get to a place in which there's enough time to make sure everybody can sort of participate and play along. So we'll do that. Please check out, we'll put it in the chat again, the charity page, even like $5, $10 donations to World Central Kitchen and some of the other foundations that we have there go a long way. Please order wine from Parcel and support, because obviously we all know what's going on with the restaurant industry. Or if you're not in New York or you can't get it shipped, like, go find one of your local wine shops. Most of them are still open and delivering, or at least letting people do takeout. So anything else I missed there, Grant?
No, that feels good. I'll try to type some of the answers that are some of the questions that we didn't get to for you guys too. So thanks a ton for being here and hanging with us, and we'll keep drinking wine.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night. See you soon. Bye.